Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mike Perkins. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Huntington County Historical Society. We are here at the Historical Museum on Court Street, and when I say we, I'm joined this evening by Dr. Dave Carnes, a fellow member of the Historical Society Board and local history buff, as well as a very special guest this evening who came into town and stopped by the museum because this is where the historical action is in Huntington County. And I'd like to introduce former President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, and welcome back to Huntington.
Yes.
Yes, I understand that perhaps Dr. Carnes may have a question about the first time you were in Huntington.
President Roosevelt, when did you first come to Huntington County?
Well, actually, the first time I stopped and visited was in October of 1900. I was running for vice president, but since Mr. McKinley stayed at home on his porch in Canton, Ohio, I was actually running for him too. But we were coming through it, come down to Fort Wayne and stayed overnight there, had some meetings, a couple of speeches to give as always, and then later on in the afternoon, we brought the Wabash down to Huntington, and of course the good folks here had a parade. You may remember that. There was a short ceremony at the courthouse. It was on the it's on the Court Street side of the courthouse, and they had erected a reviewing stand. One of the things they told me later on was they were a bit embarrassed because so many people wanted to see Vice President Roosevelt that they crowded the stage so that no one else could get on it. And it wasn't until local authorities somewhat forcibly removed some of the spectators that I had an opportunity to get off the train and go onto the stand and give a short speech. There was also a parade, I remember. If you remember, in those days, there were what they called Rough Rider clubs. And those clubs, of course, had been formed after the first United States Volunteer Cavalry that I led, the Rough Riders. And several groups got together, formed up a Catholic church up on North Jefferson, at the top of the hill. They formed up there, and then they marched down, and if I remember right, the Rochester City Band came all the way from Rochester on the Erie Railroad down to take part in that parade. It was a nice ceremony, all in all. It lasted a little over 30 minutes, if I remember right, and then we were on our way to Logansport, where we caught the train down to Indianapolis. That was the one time that I know for sure that we stopped here in Huntington. Now, I've probably been through Huntington 8 or 9 times on the railroad, but quite honestly, I generally was asleep when we went through the town. So that gives you
And the railroad is still right behind us here, close to this museum. So if later we can step out and show you.
I love railroads. I'm glad to do that any chance I get to.
I'd like to ask a more personal question. Who was your most trusted advisor?
That's an excellent question. Most trusted. I might have to say Edith Roosevelt, my wife. Mrs. Roosevelt was, I think, the most perfect first lady that we ever had. She was never afraid to give her opinion or her thoughts or ideas, but she waited to be asked. She didn't assume that the people elected her when they elected me. She knew I was president, and so she could, at best, give her thoughtful opinions and ideas, and generally they were very good. So from a trusted advisor point of view, Mrs. Roosevelt kind of has to rank up there very high. But now if you talk about official political correspondent, someone that I trusted within the government of the United States, Well, I was blessed with a magnificent cabinet that Mr. McKinley left upon his demise in September of 1901. I think the two best men in that cabinet were William Howard Taft, who was a superb administrator in the Philippines and in Cuba, and any job that you would give him. Perhaps the most politically astute, the best qualities that a president should have belong to Elihu Root, who was, he was the Secretary of War for a while, along with Secretary of State and a couple other posts. Magnificent politician, very, quite honestly, one of the stalwarts, one of the old guard conservatives in many ways. He did not necessarily share my enthusiasm for reform, but he was fair about it and honest about it. And those are qualities that are well worth something. And he was not afraid to give me his honest opinion of something. You know, I took a lot of flack over the Panama Canal issue. There were those that said that I instigated the revolution, which is ridiculous. I didn't instigate it. I knew it was coming, and I took advantage of it. But, and there were others that said that I had violated the Constitution and legal law and international law in dealing with that situation. I asked Mr. Root what he thought of what I had done to give me his honest opinion. He said, "Mr. Roosevelt, you've proven without a doubt that you are innocent of rape, but guilty of seduction." Elihu, magnificent man, and I do not mind at all that when the split came with the Republican Party in 1912, that he remained a stalwart. He was always loyal and faithful to me, but he was a stalwart Republican. He was one of the old guard.
Okay. Well, thank you for talking about your most trusted advisor. But you've met so many people in your travels,
Yes.
in your service. Other than a government advisor, perhaps, what person in society maybe fascinated you or drew your admiration?
Captain Jack Abernathy.
And who was Captain Jack Abernathy?
Well, he was an Oklahoman, and South Central Oklahoma, and he had kind of drifted down to Texas and back. He's a man after my own heart, a true individualist, a jack of all trades, if you will. He was a piano player in a saloon. He was a deputy sheriff. He was a rancher. Had a family of 6 children, marvelous children. And most fascinating was that he was a bounty hunter of wolves, but he brought them back alive. They called him Bring 'em Back Alive Abernathy was his name. Now, I first heard about this, and I did not believe it. I said, I cannot imagine going after a wolf and trying to bring it back alive. You know, all you had to do was shoot it, and then you had the pelt. Well, I saw him do it. I heard about this. In fact, there is a film in the National Archives of him catching a wolf. Of course, it's a silent film, you understand. But in 1905, 1903, spring of 03, we were in Texas and then had gone up to the Star Ranch in Oklahoma, and I asked to see Captain Abernathy, and because I wanted to see this. I had heard about it, and we went out one day, Captain Abernathy and I and some of the hosts we spotted a wolf, and we chased it for, roughly 10 miles over the Oklahoma grasslands. I'm proud to say I was the only horseman able to keep up with Captain Abernathy, and by golly, he did. We brought that wolf to bay, and he captured it, and he did it. You have to see the film to believe this, but he rode. Finally, the wolf was tired out, couldn't run any further, and it turned, as wild animals tend to do, and he wasn't going to go down easy. Well, any other man would just ride up and then shoot it. Captain Abernathy rode at reckless speed, just stopping a little ways from the wolf. He hopped down from his horse and he ran at it. And as he ran at it, the wolf opened its jaws to bite him. And you all know that when a wolf strikes, it never misses. A wolf always is on target when it's going to bite something. But before the wolf could bite, Captain Abernathy rammed his arm down the wolf's mouth into the throat, and he grabbed a hold of the back of the throat. Well, when you do that, apparently it affects the muscles here, and the wolf couldn't bite down. So, there was a live wolf at the end of Captain Abernathy's arm. And of course, you need a partner to do this, of course. Very carefully, when the wolf meekly surrendered, and sooner or later the wolves do surrender because this dominant, submissive element that wolves have, and they pried it apart and then tied the jaws together, and Captain Abernathy rode into it. I was just amazed. And then when he came to visit me in the White House, it was suggested that he go up to where they do all the movie films, in New Jersey, and film that scene. The problem was they couldn't find a wolf in New Jersey, so they used a coyote. So it's not quite as dramatic. But yes, Captain Abernathy was one of those individuals.
Memorable.
Yes, indeed.
Absolutely memorable.
Yes.
Very good. Yeah, the thought occurred to me that when you became America's 26th president
Yes.
in 1901,
Yes.
when you exceeded office in 1901, it was almost exactly at the midpoint of American history from 1776 to today. And I know you're a student of history as well.
Yes.
Of the history prior to your time in office and the history subsequent to your time in office.
Of course.
What are your thoughts about yesterday's America versus today's America, or in contrast with today's America?
Well, it is natural for people as they grow older to always look with a certain fondness back on things. And that in our youth, we were always better than we are right now, better people and better situation. That's a natural inclination. But from my viewpoint of history, I have always been an admirer of our American heroes, whether they be myths or legends or actuality. I think there is a goodness and a strength to such men as Daniel Boone and George Washington, and etc. I admire that sense of history, of American history, because it points to the greatness of the path that we were on and should stay on. I'm afraid that later on in my life, I began to feel that the American people were not quite as heroic as they once were. That this sense of destiny, this desire to move and progress ever more better in our standard and for our children and our children's children, it's almost, and I feared for this, it's almost as if we've become so desirous of living an easy life, of getting things without really working for them, that has overtaken our national character. We certainly have good people today. We certainly have had good people step up and be involved in different things after my presidency. But I just do not feel that the American people are, well, to the degree that they once were. Not that they were perfect. I mean, there were hooligans and ne'er-do-wells and scallywags, all throughout our history. But I sometimes wonder if we just haven't traded those manly traits, those desirous traits of an epic people, of a great people, for ease of living, so to speak. But then this nation has made some epic journeys in different fields, science and medicine and education. I was impressed and as proud as anybody when we put a man on the moon. And that's quite an achievement.
Yes, it certainly was. Certainly was. Let me pick up on something you were talking about. You used the word progress. You, of course, are very closely identified with the progressive movement. There is a progressive movement afoot in today's America.
I know, yes.
How would you define the progressive movement of your time in office, your time in the political arena? How would you define that? What was being sought and what was achieved?
I believe that the Progressive Party was emblematic of the progressive reform movement. We weren't trying to change the nation necessarily politically. We were trying to improve the life of the common American, the average American, giving them a square deal without fear from big business, major trusts, unregulated affairs, whether they be business or social or anything like this. The reform movement, for example, in 1912, we were for women's rights to vote. Well, are you against women voting? If you're for it, then you lean toward the progressives. We were for a shorter work week. Well, if you're against that, obviously, then you wouldn't be a progressive. We were for disability, what people today would consider like a disability income, amongst other things. We were for free textbooks in the schools, and we were for all children going to school. It was compulsory. It was, you didn't have a choice, and so you could send your 8 or 9-year-old into the coal mines to help the family affair. And we were for getting children out of the coal mines and out of the woolen mills. If you were supportive of that, you could be a reform progressive. And to be honest, we were for an income tax. That may shock people, scare people, but let me remind you that the income tax that we proposed was 1% if you made less than $20,000 a year. And of course, 90% of Americans made less than $20,000 a year in 1912. Now, eventually, that would raise to all of 3% if you made more than $500,000 a year, which I think is somewhere equivalent to $4 million nowadays, something like this. So it was a responsible, I believe, reform that we instituted for this income tax. The problem, and quite honestly, it's one that I'm not sure I could answer adequately, is the government that would be capable of doing this, of protecting the common man, also is capable of abusing the law. You know, the income tax might not be 3% in 10 years or 20 years. You know, it might go all the way up to 12 or 15%. Who knows? Well, where does that stop? Well, it stops when you have a responsible Congress. And unfortunately, in the United States of America, our Congress has proven time and time again it is utterly incapable of control or responsibility. Of course, that's one of the fun things about being president, is fighting such congressmen as exist for their own nefarious purposes. I can remember that, I think it was 1905 or 1906, there was a bill. We were trying to get the Hepburn bill about railroad regulation passed through, and by golly, it didn't sell. It was tough to push it through Congress. Of course, I was a lame duck president in that term. Another bill did go through, but it was loaded with so much pork that you were embarrassed to even have your name associated with it in any way. But the congressmen, the senators were bound determined to take as much as they could out of that bill. And one newspaper, which I should send them a letter of commendation and thanks, said the only thing notable about this most recent Congress was the ingenious way that they could pick everybody's pocket. And you would hope that sooner or later we would have a Congress that actually was moral and responsible, but I'm not sure I see that, because looking back as far as George Washington, he had problems with his Congress, as small as it was. Did I get off the point there?
I don't know. We'll let the viewer
all right.
make that determination, but I will turn the floor back to Dr. Carnes.
President Roosevelt, I have a question. A man so engaged, so busy, so involved, how did you balance your family obligations?
That's a fair question. I tried to involve my family as much as I could in all the activities that we could do. You know, there were times when we, like on my Western trip or the trip to the Grand Canyon, I took a couple of the boys along. If we were back in Sagamore Hill, and I loved to be in Sagamore Hill, we were always either working on the homestead, or we were playing games, football, tennis, on the lawns, everything. Everybody was active, and we enjoyed one another's companies greatly. We'd go riding together. We had somewhere 8 or 10 horses at the White House, and it was a normal thing to see the Roosevelt or some of the Roosevelts out riding their horses or going for what more modern people call power walks. You would see that, but we had fun. When the children were smaller and playing in the White House, often I would join them in games of hide and seek or something like this, or snowball fights or whatever, but we always made sure that Christmas was special with the family, and it just seemed to work out. I'm not sure if there was any rhyme or reason to it, but Edith was wise enough to know that she didn't have 6 children, she had 7, including me, and so she very rarely interfered with those duties and trips that I would take, and she was very good at running an organized household. Like all wives, she was worried about finances. You know, the president gets a nice salary, but it's nothing. When you have 6 children and you live in a place like Washington, D.C., that salary can be cut down very quickly. But
The boys, of course, in the White House years, Theodore, Ted Jr., he was away and getting into college and getting out on his own by that time, as was Kermit. Ethel was a young teenage girl. Alice was an old teenage girl, so to speak. And then, of course, there was Archie and Quentin. And they just always seemed to be ready for some adventure. You know, we would have pillow fights, and at night, just getting them into bed was an adventure. Edith often yelled at all of us, you know, to quiet down, settle down, you know, go to your room, go to sleep. So she was sort of the matriarch of the family.
Sounds as if they got their adventurous spirit honestly.
Oh, they did indeed. I really think it came from my mother's side of the family, the Bullocks of Georgia. The Roosevelt side, they were very, there was a sense of business to them. The good people, good business, a sense of philanthropy with it. Ideas of public service came through my grandmother Roosevelt, Margaret Barnhill Roosevelt, and but the sense of pirates and scallywags, of high adventures and pioneers, I think that came through my mother's mother, Martha Stewart Bullock. So, but then they all inherited it, and they all gave 110% wherever they were at. And they made good newspaper copy, you know. No matter what people thought about Theodore Roosevelt, they liked the Roosevelt family.
That's important.
Yes, it is.
How do you want us to remember you?
Well, that's a fair and honest question. Quite honestly, I want to be known as well, in a good way, a masculine president, a man who would lead men into battle rather than send them into battle. I would want to say that I was never afraid of death, which is one of the reasons I was fit to live the type of life I led. But as far as achievements are concerned, the two greatest achievements, I've always said this, I believe that the Great White Fleet, sending it around the world in 1907 to give the world an idea of our naval power, and that we were no longer a third-rate nation at the table of nations, that we were somebody to be considered. Sending the Great White Fleet around the world, and then the Panama Canal in 1903, which I believe is a boon to mankind. I think those are the two greatest political achievements. However, since then, and as I've looked back over the years, if I am remembered for what I did as president for conservation, not just creating or doubling the number of national parks, creating national forests, national monuments, national memorials, but putting the idea of conservation, of the value of the magnificent wonders that our nation is, if that would have people, they would think kindly of me and say, he did a pretty good job. If that's my legacy, I can live with that quite easily.
Fair enough.
Certainly understand that, absolutely.
Yes.
Mr. President, I understand you also like to be referred to as Colonel.
Yes, that's true.
Colonel Roosevelt, I'll do you that honor then. You have traveled from coast to coast in this
Yes.
nation of ours. You have traveled around the world. You've seen many places. You are a native of New York.
Yes, I am.
And so you have had an experience with a number of people and across a wide cross-section of Americans. In Indiana, in Huntington, Indiana, in the Midwest, in the heartland, how would you describe the Americans of the heartland what special characteristics or qualities might they exhibit based on what you've seen and seen in contrast with elsewhere?
Fair question. My first answer is they vote Republican. You know, Ohio and Indiana are key states. The Republican Party needs Ohio and Indiana, like to have Illinois too, but would really need those states. And I think that the rural American and the small town American and even small business, if you will, you know, they exemplify the idea of hard work, of self-reliance, of making things happen, never necessarily sitting still. I've always thought that the Methodist Church, of course I'm an Episcopalian myself, but the Methodist Church was the most American of churches. And if you've ever attended their church meetings, there's a pride in themselves and a pride in what they've done, a pride of where they're going, and of course they sing like nobody's business. Nobody sings as much as the Methodists sing. And of course the great base of the Methodists tends to be the Midwest. And of course the legacy of our ancestors, the boys in blue, as it were, who fought the great Civil War for Father Abraham and the Union, it still dwells strongly in the Midwest. There is a difference in the country. You know, there is a difference between the state of New York or New York City and well, Atlanta, Georgia, and California, and all that. We are one people, and yet we are different people in many regards. I think the stalwart nature, the strength of the individual, more than anything else, tends to live here in the Midwest. Now that may change, you know, communications in so many ways, transportation brings us all closer, so we may really blend together someday. But as far as I see right now, that would be the answer to a question, a true American spirit here.
Well defined, and thank you. Now, I know this is your first time to our historical museum,
Yes.
and welcome to it. And I believe that when we sign off here shortly, we'll be very happy to have you take a look at what we have here, enjoy the exhibits. Anything you're particularly interested in that you can maybe see just from where we are at our vantage point in the room here?
Well, I know that you have some military paraphernalia over there, and of course I've always had an interest in the military, both Army and Navy. Of course,
Yes.
the Spanish-American War, I just had to go with the Army. I mean, I was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, but I'm not really very good at being on ship. I don't think I'd be in my element, but I'm not a bad horseman, and so leading a cavalry regiment was just fine with me. And let's see, I think I saw a uniform over there, a coat belonging to a gentleman from Huntington County, I believe during the Spanish-American War, so it's a familiar coat
Yes.
to me. And I do have to admit that your railroad display is
Outstanding.
interesting. I love to, when I was president, I loved to stop the train just outside the city limits of Washington, D.C., and hop down from my car and go up to the engine and kind of run the train. I always wanted to run things. I never wanted to be a follower. I always wanted to be a leader. So leading a train is just a magnificent, fun thing to do. In fact, I had so much fun and apparently did it fairly well that I became an honorary member of the Brotherhood of Engineers. So,
Was not aware of that.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps we can show you, I'm sure you've heard about Indiana high school basketball.
Yes.
It has a reputation nationwide. Dr. Carnes is a former high school basketball player here.
Most
in Huntington.
excellent.
Yes.
There's an extensive collection of basketball memorabilia in the next room here. Perhaps we'll give you a tour, a brief tour and an exposure to Hoosier hysteria.
I would love that. It's a wonderful place just to kind of roam around and look. Brings a bit of nostalgia
Yes.
back here and there.
Well, we're delighted to have you. Dr. Carnes, thank you.
Thank you, President Roosevelt.
Thank you, Dr.
Colonel, Mr. President, thank you for being here with us and sharing your thoughts and your perspectives and your wisdom with us and with our audience.
Delighted to be here.
Bully.
Bully.
Bully indeed.
Great.